technological as well, which I think bodes well. At the same time, I believe that if you compare us to other countries, especially the more technologically advanced countries of the world, we do have several gaps that we still need to fill and plug. I today believe we have a very good set of panelists. So I'm going to first invite Mrs. Bahadur to share her views on this theme, on what are the key policy priorities to be addressed for the next 25 years of science and technology in India. And then post that, we'll move to Ms. Chaudhary. So Ms. Bahadur, if I could request you to kick us off.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Suri. And thanks for the kind introduction and giving me a chance to share my views, and particularly from the innovation technology domain. I am really glad to be talking about, in fact, more different from the usual technology. So this is really very important. And if I primarily my views will be from my own experience and what have been my expectations and experience so far. If I see the key priority policy areas for the next 25 years, so I would like to focus on the role of private sector participation, and particularly when we have missions, research and R&D programs from DST, Ministry of Science and Technology. I would like to make a point like industry should be there right from the program stage, instead of having a project sanction and then looking for industry partners. If we can have CSR funding or CSTIR, if we can bring in something, that kind of thing, so those industries could be there right from the proposal inception, and those with them we can write the projects and we can take ahead. So this kind of thing. And then I would like to emphasize on incentivizing STEM learning through fellowship and assurance to the students from school and college level during the incubation ideation stages, because this will help in enhancing the number of scientific R&D professionals in India, which are very less compared to China and US. And third very important aspect I would like to look forward is on the IP laws, which need stricter enforcement, and the whole process of IP should be a little faster, and general public or college students should be knowing, and the teachers themselves should be more aware of the IP laws. And towards the another point is adoption of indigenous technology should be promoted through our own industries. And last point, which I would like to put across, is the national scientific committees like the DST, DBTs, or the principal scientific advisor. They should be having industry partnership on board since announcement or since inception of these programs, so that they can guide well and mentor such programs and institutions and the PIs. So that's all for the opening remarks. Thank you.
No, thanks, Mr. Bahadur. I think you covered in a nutshell 5 or 6 very key points, which I'll come back and dig deeper on. But first, let me now go to our second panelist and get her views. So Ms. Chaudhary, if you could also share your perspective on what are some of the key policy priorities for the next 25 years that India should keep in mind.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. Suri, and thanks a lot, Ms. Bahadur, for sharing those wonderful points, and big thanks to civil society for really enabling this conversation for us. I think I'd like to start by saying that one of the most fundamental shifts that we need to bring in the mindset is about how we perceive science. Science is typically looked as only a public good. I think that's great, but at the same time, science is also a profitable business opportunity for the scientists and for our own country. So I think that is a paradigm shift that we really need to bring in the mindsets of everybody within the country. And once we are open to such a change, then of course we can work around a lot of policy changes. In terms of specific policy changes, I have 5 points to make, and I'll keep them very brief. Number one is that, there is this constant battle that goes on between academic independence versus mission-driven projects where there is a need to demonstrate return on science and technology. However, I personally feel that the both will always and need to coexist with each other. So therefore, what we really need is autonomy. So we need autonomy in the area of science and technology. Our institutions, our scientists, our people who are working on ground need to be more empowered, and they need to be allowed to work in an autonomous manner. And if that happens, then of course, both academic independence as well as the need to demonstrate return on investment in science can coexist with each other. So that is number one, the autonomy in science. Second point is about really having a policy around citizen science engagement. Last 7 years, we have seen startups and innovation becoming a household word because there was so much of top-down pressure and there was so much of awareness that was created around it. So similarly, we need to be able to make science and technology an attractive option for our young people. People should not be coming to science because they don't have any other option. They should be coming to science because they really find it cool, they find it fashionable, and they are passionate about it. So that is another policy change that we really need to be able to bring. And there are some examples. We have India Science Festival, the India International Science Festival, things like Foldscope, Adult Tinkering Lab. These are good examples of citizen science engagements. But I think if we get a formal policy around the citizen science, that would be absolutely brilliant, again, to be able to attract high quality talent in science. Then similarly, third is science diplomacy. I think that's another area where India can really leverage the existing ties we have created with so many different countries, especially in the last 2-3 years of COVID, where there has been a lot of exchange of resources, information, vaccine, etc. So we need to build more on that because we are slightly ahead of continents like Africa and some other Asian countries when it comes to the science and technology learning curve. So that's where, again, we must leverage and build on that for our science diplomacy. Fourth is we need to also focus on doing science through philanthropy. Right now, majority of all our funding comes from government sources. But again, last 2 years has seen a little bit of change. The Office of Principal Scientific Advisor had worked very closely with so many different philanthropists to bring in their funds into R&D. So I think that also needs to become a norm through policy, that you need to be able to do science through funding sources which are outside the government. And fifth, the most important is also about how we measure science. How do we measure impact of the science? And we have to remember that this impact is going to be different for scientists. It will be different for policymakers. It will be different for people who fund the science. Again, there has to be a cohesion, but we need to transform the way we measure and evaluate the outcomes and the impact of science. So I think these are the 5 areas where I really need that we need to shift our focus to be able to really transform the way science and technology is perceived and conducted and measured in India right now. Thank you. I'll pause here.
Great. Thanks so much, Ms. Chaudhary. I think much like Ms. Bahadur, you were very, I think you covered a lot of ground. And so there's a lot to unpack amongst the 5 pieces you also highlighted. Let's first start with 2 pieces that you both mentioned. One, it's clear, I think from Ms. Bahadur, your remarks that there's a need for private sector capital to come in. Ms. Chaudhary, you mentioned obviously philanthropic capital also. At the same time, Ms. Bahadur, you mentioned that industry should be involved, not post the project getting sanctioned, but really be involved in the planning phases itself, which touches upon the point I think, Ms. Chaudhary, you were making about that autonomy piece as well, right? To what extent do we provide autonomy to our researchers, to our research institutions to work on projects that are both relevant to them, but also to industry? So first, let me actually ask you a question around that. So as we see it, there's this industry academia linkage that needs to be built or be built better, let's say. So if I can ask a question to both of you to address, what are the gaps in that industry academia linkage today that exist? Why do those gaps exist? And how could those gaps start to get filled?
As I said, okay, if you want to take. So as I said, the very relevant question, like why does this gap exist, is simply because industry, there is somehow a very, it's a real problem which I have faced as a scientist, is that industry feels that, researchers feel that we cannot share something because we have got something unique, and industry might take it. Industry feels the research is not enough, it's not something great that we need to fund it. We can, if we come to know somehow, we can develop it through our own R&D centers. So this kind of divide or mistrust among both the communities need to be bridged, frankly speaking. And industry should understand, because just taking my own example, through any researcher, not my example, or any general researcher who does PhD throughout. So with fellowships, again, see, government is funding right from PhD. Then we go to postdoctoral, here also government is funding through SCRB or young scientist projects. Then coming to third level of research, where we develop this technology through Water Technology Initiative, Water Mission Project of DST. So government has throughout funded my career, and I have reached TRL 7, right from 1 to 7, government through government funding. And now when technology is ready to be commercialized, I really need industry, because that science has to be worked with industry engineers to be translated into a large scale product and deployed. And here, without industry support, even government funding is a major problem. So at least after coming to this advanced stage, industry should come. So this is my real requirement as a researcher, and just like many others like me. So this understanding, industry should take responsibility, because ultimately any technology or product which has come, it is ultimately to the benefit of the industry. So this industry has to take the onus, and some top-down approach, policy approach, as I said, CSR policy, just like we can have STM policy for the industries, and they should be investing some money. This should come from the policy from the government of India. Thank you.
Ms. Chaudhary, any pieces to add?
Sure. I'll just add two minor points. I think what Ms. Bahadur already mentioned, I like to put it as, there's lack of trust between the academia, scientists, and the industry. And I think it goes back to the fact that because there are no incentives for scientists to start working early on with industry, that is what really creates this complex environment where, the languages both the sides talk, the vocabulary they speak with, they don't understand each other's vocabulary. But again, I do want to highlight that, having said that, last 2 years, we did see some very nice, beautiful partnerships emerge between the industry and academia during COVID. And I strongly feel that was because there was this whole sense of ownership. There was this whole sense of working towards a common mission. So I think if we are able to, of course, create some enabling policies which will allow the academia and industry to co-own certain large, complex problems to solve, it will really ensure that the two are able to work with each other on a long-term basis, then they are able to trust each other, and then they're also able to leverage each other's capability towards solving these large, complex problems. So I think primarily it's lack of trust, lack of incentives, and lack of these common goals, which do exist, but then they haven't really been explored in a manner where the both can come together and solve those problems like we saw for COVID. That's what I think. Thank you.
No, great. I think that's very helpful. But let me dig deeper and make it slightly more specific. So, Ms. Bahadur, obviously you've worked on specific projects that you were mentioning around water where you felt that industry could have been more supportive. So let me ask you, and at the risk of being a little bit maybe controversial, can you name 5 companies in the Indian context or the global context who you would have loved to have be involved in your project earlier?
I can't. Naming the companies would not serve the purpose.
Or you can, maybe
because
give us some color around the kind of companies that could have been involved, that could have helped. And then I have a couple of follow-on questions. That's just the first.
The companies which actually we are pursuing now, and we are ready for commercialization, and we are into negotiation stages also. So here is where again we are stuck, that companies are coming, but that negotiation period is so much, and they don't want to invest, they don't want to take risk. Even believing that any technology has reached TRL 7 or 8 means it is a well established, and throughout for last 15 years it has been funded through government projects. So that kind of faith could come. And companies which we are looking forward to, like the wastewater treatment companies, who can come with us for R&D, for upscaling and implementation. So all these big companies who work in the domain of wastewater treatment, membrane technologies, or working in under various national mission projects like the Namami Gange, establishment of ETPs and STPs. So these kinds of companies we are looking forward to.
Sure. And so if I can dig deeper on that now that we have a sense of the kind of companies that would have been very helpful to have, be involved with you earlier on, what, if you can dig deeper and tell me what were some of the things that you would do differently now, having now had that experience over the last few years and now being in the midst of these negotiations, what would you have as a researcher done differently? Would you have engaged with them much earlier on? Would you, or on the other hand, would you have required there be a third party, either a private sector entity or a non-private sector entity, that was facilitating this conversation between you, the researcher, or the research team, and the corporate? Would that make the negotiation happen easier or faster? Or are there other kind of institutional gaps we have that we could have filled to make that process better for you? So what would you do differently now that you've had the hindsight experience that you've had?
In fact, reaching 7 or 8 TRL is, it has not been possible without support of industry. So we have had support of small and very MSME companies who provided their samples to us, who discussed with them their problems, and based on those problems, we developed science and technology. So I would always credit, and I would never say that industries have, in fact, small industries have definitely helped to reach us this stage. They have helped us in understanding the problem. But now the challenge is to upscale. We have orders in hand, we have projects in hand, where we have to demonstrate, let's say, to a suitable larger capacity. But here we urgently need a larger company who has capital, who could invest and come along. So this kind of gap can be definitely filled directly with negotiations, or as you say, a third party, a mediator could be required, who would, or any government or any mission who can say that we take the responsibility. In our case, again, we are fortunate to have National Mission for Clean Ganga, who has come forward and set up this Center of Excellence for water reuse. And having this COE means a third party validation, where government, and throughout my funding by government, supports that, yes, we have confidence in such a technology platform, and now you may come and partner with us. So this kind of approach will be the best, and we have it, fortunately. Thank you.
Would it have been helpful, Ms. Bahadur, if, you mentioned obviously the government has largely funded the research, right, up till now. Yeah. Do you think, and as you, I think both you and Ms. Chaudhary mentioned about the need for private sector involvement early on, do you think the response of the larger industry that you need today, the larger firms that you need today, would their response be different if they had maybe been one of the early funders of your research?
Yes, certainly.
Maybe directly or indirectly, an indirect route that, for example, in my world, in the world of technology, venture capital exists is sometimes large corporates will fund venture capital firms who then fund startups or interesting technological innovations, right? So sometimes it's indirect and not necessarily directly, but if there is an early stage commitment on the financial side from a large industrial player in a research project like, let's say, yours, then it might actually be easier when you're looking to now scale something that you've done pilots with.
Exactly. This is exactly what is needed. because it's not just about the capital. We have sanctioned projects, which means capital is there. Only the engineering capability to develop a product, to have a process flows, those engineering capabilities will only come from EPC contractor companies or the companies who are into such project implementation. So definitely it will change the landscape.
Sure. Let me move on to now another aspect of this financing piece, which is philanthropic, as Ms. Chaudhary, you mentioned, versus just pure private sector capital coming in to capitalize on a economic opportunity. It's not that there's necessarily a choice to be made between the two. Both should be, I think, leveraged as channels, right? Philanthropic capital coming in certain cases, and let's say just private sector capital coming in certain cases. But if I was to assume the private sector hat for a second, typically a large company in any sector would typically invest in R&D that's relevant to the kind of space that they're operating in, the kind of products they believe can scale up in their respective industries, which often means that they will want to direct what kind of research takes place. Right. So I'll take the example of, let's say, EVs today. If I'm an EV manufacturer today or an auto manufacturer in India today, any of the large ones, I know that battery storage, battery technology is a key constraint or a key problem to be solved in the Indian context. So actually, ideally, I would put in money into research institutions in India to say, help me solve this specific problem. As opposed to a researcher coming and developing battery technology on their own and then trying to sell it to them, right? So are we going to do research supply driven approach, or more a research demand driven approach? So I want to get your thoughts on which of these two would work better in the Indian context over the coming 20, 25 years, a more industry demand driven research agenda or a researcher supply driven research agenda?
Certainly, industry demand-driven approach is better, because today we don't have to sell what we are doing. We have to talk about what is the need of the nation, what is the mood of the nation, where are the funds, how the mission projects, because they take these strides. So they've certainly the industry demand-driven and national mission project-driven approach is best.
Ms. Chaudhary?
Yeah, thanks. I have a slightly different opinion here. I think because India still continues to live in 3 different centuries, I think both these approaches will have to coexist with each other. It is not one of the two, but I think we have to understand that how to maximize on each of these approaches in different scenarios. So we need science for society, social sectors. That's where, yes, you need a lot of more industry to be able to solve those problems. We need science for emerging technology, which is futuristic. That's where, you need more of academic independence. And then we also need science for emergency and disaster management. That's again where you need industry to be able to take those solutions and address the disaster scenarios. So I think you will never be able to find an ideal scenario where one can say, okay, I need to invest more in a generic manner on industry or demand driven versus supply driven. The both will continue to coexist. And that's why I go back to my initial point where I started, that you need both of them, but you need science autonomy. If you have autonomy, then of course you can build thriving relationships between the industry and the academia. Because, and even if you look at the international models in different countries, you always see that the government comes in as the first investor. However, very soon you will start seeing private capital coming in and then they start co-owning, co-investing in that long-term journey together. That is what really makes these projects investable for the long term. And that is what will ensure that these projects get converted into an innovation, which is actually converted into a technology, which is then being adopted and diffused. So it has to be a mix of both. I mean, I will never be able to say one of the two is the right answer.
Sure. I think that's a key debate for us to solve. And I think, Ms. Chaudhary, your point is also well taken, that in certain contexts, one of the two approaches might work better. In other contexts, the second one might work better. Let me now ask you on a related point, the question of, and I think Ms. Chaudhary, you were starting to touch upon this just now, is as a country, given the specific needs we have very different societal needs, given the different socioeconomic groups and contexts that coexist today in India, and probably will continue to coexist. What are some of the sectors that you believe we need to prioritize as part of our R&D ecosystem? Obviously, given the constraints of capital, given the constraints of talent, as Ms. Bahadur, you mentioned in your earlier remarks, given the general lack of a thriving ecosystem as exists in some other countries, we cannot aim to do everything, right? So at some point, we need to, as a country, figure out a way to decide what some of those sectoral priorities should be. So my question is twofold. One is, what should those sectors be according to your individual viewpoints? And second is a procedural question. How should, as a country, we come to those sectoral priorities? Is the government best place to do that? Is the academia best place to do that? Is industry best place to do that? Or obviously, as we've been saying, a trilateral sort of a committee or a group of people to come together to decide on those sectoral priorities would be the best process. So if you can both, maybe I'll start with you, Ms. Chaudhary, and then we'll go to Ms. Bahadur.
Sure, thanks. It's a complex question, and I would say that if we get answer to this, then we know what we need to do for the next 25 years. Anyways, I think when I talk about, like I said, 3 different centuries. So one part is focusing on the emerging technology. And when I talk about emerging technology, I think what we need to realize is that India is still in the growth phase. But how we can differentiate ourselves from the developed world is that, can we grow green? And when I say grow green, basically means that whatever new technologies we develop, we need to be able to ensure that we are controlling our carbon emissions. So I think decarbonization of industry is a huge area where we should be able to continue to get innovations, get new technologies, but at the same time, not add to the deterioration of the environment, which has been a great insight for us over the last few years, because we have seen that's what the developed world has done. So I think growing in a green manner is a very, very important area, sector for us, and a lot of things will come under that. Then second is, of course, given our experience with the pandemic, I think One Health is another area where we really need to focus a lot more. And in fact, recently a new mission has been announced from the Principal Scientific Advisor's Office around this One Health. And that's also because India has done well with human vaccines. So can we replicate that story for animal husbandry sector also? I think that is the fundamental question we are all asking from each other. And again, it goes back to the earlier point that we need to be able to enable green growth. So as we continue to grow, we have to ensure that the biodiversity also continues to preserve. So therefore, One Health becomes another important aspect. And in fact, again, here, Uttarakhand and a couple of more states are coming forward to be able to adopt the biodiversity report of Das Gupta to see that how do we continue to focus on One Health area. And then the third area, which I really want to put forward for emerging technology, is genomics and precision medicine. I think that's where, again, we have built good capacity. We have good infrastructure around biotechnology. How do we really take it to a level up and also become a leader for precision medicine? So that's another area. So that's for emerging technology. And when we quickly move to social sectors, I think that's where it's all about really technology diffusion. We have lots of technologies existing in India which can solve problems for water, sanitation, air pollution. But I think what we don't have is those solutions being taken up by the district level to be able to solve those problems. So I think that's where it's more about a process-oriented innovation that you need. You need a bottom-up approach where districts can come up and say, okay, this is my problem and I need to take up this technology to solve that problem. So I think it's a very different approach when we look at emerging sector versus the social sector. Emerging needs more R&D, social needs more technology diffusion. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Ms. Bahadur?
If we look at the Government of India's recent initiatives, so a lot of emphasis is there on the major areas or the newer areas like the quantum and genetic mapping. Also in the areas of AI, 3D printing, drones, agri-tech, and DNA storage. So these are where government has already taken steps, and these are the technologies for the future. And they have started developing, and they have to be taken forward. Whereas what I believe, and I have been practicing for last 25 years, 25 years now, is to solve a very practical problem which matters to you and me or any citizen of the country. The real problem solving approach. This is my working approach as well. So we should really fund or ask the people or the researchers at the core level if we can solve the day-to-day problems. For example, we are approaching November, now December, the problem of air pollution, the stubble burning. Can we mitigate it? How we can address this issue by reusing the stubble? These are some real problems. Like then another problem challenging which is coming across is the AMR, antimicrobial resistance in water, or in general we can talk about. Then the problem of micropollutants, microplastics, which is fast growing, and where a few European countries have policies and laws on them, whereas we don't talk about them. So these are the areas where I would really look forward in next 25 years to develop R&D and have policy in these areas. Then water surveillance, epidemiology, life cycle assessment. Then nanobiotechnology has a great role to play, where we can work on nanopesticide, nanonutrients, which have direct relevance on our government agenda of agricultural priorities with doubling the income of the farmers and all. And last, I would again come back to the problems like we only talk about over the year in summers or winters or during rainy season about froth in the Yamuna or ammonia levels in the Yamuna. So if as a society together, taking all stakeholders, first we can understand the problem, then we can come out with technological scientific solutions, and then third come the role. So as you rightly said, the tripartite role of the researchers, the government, and industry is needed in solving these existing problems and the futuristic research areas. Thank you.
Great. A lot to chew on there. So I think if Ms. Bahadur, I understand correctly, you created two buckets. One was socially relevant, India-specific problems, and that technology should really focus on solving those, versus the fancy sounding futuristic technologies that don't necessarily concern the lay Indian citizen.
Exactly.
And in a way, I think, Ms. Chaudhary, you made a similar categorization, right? I think the emerging tech that you mentioned might coincide with some of the futuristic technologies that Ms. Bahadur said should be deprioritized in favor of the social sector technologies that Ms. Chaudhary, you mentioned that are more day-to-day problems in our lives, like around water, sanitation, health, etc. At the same time, however, Ms. Chaudhary, if I understood you correctly, you had in your categorization of emerging tech also some very citizen-centric problems that could get solved. Right? So if I understand correctly, you don't see such a clear divide between the two, whereas Ms. Bahadur, you are seeing a clear divide between the two. So let me push both of you on that. Is there, and I'll give you the reason I'm asking the question, because it's an important question. I think as a country of our socioeconomic level, we have a choice to make. Maybe it's a false choice, but it's a choice that needs to be discussed. Today, if you come to Bangalore, you will find people who are talking about Web 3.0. You're talking about people talking about artificial intelligence, quantum, even biotech, genomics, etc. And they want to compete with the best in the world. They want to compete with Silicon Valley. They want to compete with Israel. They want to compete with the best of the best. At the same time, I live in Delhi, I think as you might also. And air pollution is, at the end of the day, one of the core problems that me, my kids, everyone in Delhi suffers from. Right? So it's a key problem that as we think about where the priorities should lie for India, do we want to become globally competitive and be the best in some of these emerging tech areas? Because that's what actually might create massive wealth creation. That might actually see massive wealth creation. In my book, The Great Tech Game, in fact, one of the first sections is about history, and I talk about how different countries that have emerged as winners in the different eras in the past have been ones that have managed to win in the emerging technologies.
Exactly.
So if you look at the global trade era when oceanic trade started, the Portuguese mastered navigation technology better than some of the others, managed to come across Africa and start to colonize, overcame the Suez Canal barriers that were put up for them. If you look at the steam engine, you look at Great Britain, they managed to master a new technology, an emerging technology of that time, and that leads them, in combination with the navigation technology, to become colonial masters, but also industrial masters. Then you see the US, right, which emerges as a key player because they master electricity. And later, even the sort of the ICE, the internal combustion engine, right? So you see massive auto companies coming out of the US. You see the likes of GE, etc., coming out of the US. And so you see that in history, sometimes it's actually being able to master emerging technologies that has led countries to really leapfrog in their economic wealth creation cycle, right? And so one of the arguments I make in my book is to say that as India, we must not be always chasing the tail of tech waves. We must now not be chasing the semiconductor wave when we're already 30 years too late. We must be looking at climate tech. In fact, Ms. Chaudhary, what you mentioned as growing green, as clean tech as your first priority in the emerging tech. In my book, I argue that climate tech or clean tech is one of those emerging waves where India should take an early lead and actually prioritize that emerging tech, because that could lead to creation of massive wealth creation in India, because we'll create technology that the world needs. And that will then trickle down to help us solve some of the social sector technological issues that we face today, which are largely of, let's say, diffusion or adoption. So in that context, in that historical context also, now let me ask you the question again. Given that I see that divide between your thinking and your suggestions, tell me, is that divide maybe not there? Maybe we need to do both, but then you have to address the question of resource constraints. Or would you change your answer to that question now? Do we prioritize emerging tech or social tech and diffusion and adoption of tech?
I think, Ms. Chaudhary, if you are to answer, or whom should?
Sure. I think I'll continue to say what I said, that we live in 3 different centuries, so we need both. It is just about the context. Some places we have to invest more on the diffusion adoption so that we can solve problems of air pollution at a local level, at a state level. However, the country still needs to invest in emerging technology. And you have pointed out very rightly, Mr. Suri, that if you don't have the emerging tech, you really cannot imagine a future where you will continue to be powerful and coexist with other countries as well in this world. See, growth is a complex phenomena. It really requires politics, economics, sociology. All of these have to come together. And that's where, it's not going to be black and white. These are different shades of gray, if I can go to the extent of saying that. So we have to invest in climate technology. We have to invest in a lot of futuristic technologies. Only then we will be able to be at par in the growth curve. But at the same time, yes, we have to also solve local problems and improve the quality of life. So that is, I think, the unique and complex problem that India needs to solve as a country. So like I said, the both will continue to coexist. And that's why we cannot continue to fight between academic independence and the mission-driven approach. Both are required.
Sure. Ms. Bahadur?
See, even I never say that we have to choose one. The problem with in ours, it's a developing country. We are a developing country and we have to face the challenges of economic growth, sustainability, environment, compliance, and social development. So such a complex scenario. Just imagine about the government of India, how it is managing. So these are the 5 things which bind, they are on the government, like they have to take care of this. And at the same time, we are in the transition phase as well, where we, as you rightly said, we cannot chase the tail. So we have to take lead. So I think having both at different levels, emerging technologies, we can have it at the basic levels, and already where we are established, we can take it at the advanced level. This approach we can have. Then secondly, we can focus on our strengths. For example, if India has strength, large population is a problem, but again, we have large the skilled manpower or the technology. If we can work on the technology domain, export or manpower, you can say, we can have that. Then solar is our strength. Wind energy can be, so renewables can be our strength. Then we have a large coastal line, so desalination. So we have to choose our strength where we can work. So we have to have different approaches, taking all together. This is because we are such a huge population country. We have to take care of all levels, masses, and of course the economy, the development, growth, everything. So we have to take and have a balance on all these sectors, I would say.
Sure. Great. I think that's probably a key important debate, right, on how we will fix those priorities and what those priorities should be, given our complex needs as a nation,
Exactly.
both domestically and to remain globally competitive and ahead.
Exactly.
So let me now move to a related question, right? So every time you're trying to solve a problem like this as a nation, at least my view is that because we are already behind the curve, there are other countries that we can learn from. There are other countries who've embarked on these journeys earlier, who have had different levels of success. So let me ask both of you, given that both of you have probably had exposure to the ecosystems, the R&D ecosystems thriving in other countries as well, what are some of the lessons that we can learn on some of the challenges we have been discussing for the last 30 to 40 minutes from countries that have done well on this R&D piece? Countries like the US come to mind, obviously, Korea comes to mind, Israel comes to mind, China comes to mind in more recent years. But really, it's not about X country or Y country, but what are some of the key lessons that you believe we in India can imbibe as we think about setting these priorities from the experiences of other countries?
So, may I?
Please.
So, see, the lessons, like I have I've taken 3 countries, particularly the US, China, and Israel. So if we talk about US first, so US has huge investment in R&D activities and the STEM-based education system since schooling, and so this is a huge strength. And this is why having the strong STEM system at the early stages, they have the high innovation index. That is one thing. And policies comes after due diligence, debates, stakeholder discussions, market analysis, and the direct private investment funding, the facilitation in the R&D and I ecosystem and the startup is the best in US. So these are the 3 things which we can take up from US. Next, coming to China, what I have read, I have understood is that China, in fact, we have so much to learn from China as well, because we are similar with them in some aspects, like the population, the labor, which is relatively cheaper. We both are a developing country and aspiring countries. So here what we can see is, well, on the STIP index as well, China is there because of 2 reasons. What, to my understanding, is that first is the R&D expenditure is thrice or 4-fold than India. And the policy initiatives which China has is, first of all, the country has shifted away from a potentially planned economy to a free market governance, which has given them edge to utilize its comparative advantage in manufacturing and market segment to a greater extent. And secondly, the government policy that boosts these R&D growth in China is the high-speed infrastructure, particularly the railways, the waterways, and the A's of business for the foreign investors. Probably these are the policy interventions which we could also see. And third is the example of Israel, I would say, is a classic example, because as per the 2015 report, Israel has the highest 4.9% of the GDP investment in the R&D, highest in among all these nations. So particularly what we can learn is that the huge R&D investment is there, more than other developed countries even, and the contribution from the private sector in investment and A's in policy to allow investors to come in the initial investment and growth stages is the key to their innovation index. Thirdly, the companies like the IBM, Microsoft, Intel have their R&D and I centers in Israel. And more than 50% of Israel's exports are related to technological advances. So here again is a great lesson. And fourth is that they have utilized their weaknesses as their strengths. This is my particular interpretation. And I would cite one example, that water crisis and agriculture. Israel being a country which was known for its water crisis 2 decades ago. And they have taken that as their advantage and utilized most of their R&D in development of water technologies, innovation in drinking, desalination, whatever, and agricultural. They have some of the best practices in the agriculture, which they have taught the world. So again, we have to take into strides our sometimes the advantages to us. So these are the lessons I would say from the 3 countries. Thank you.
Great, no, very helpful, Ms. Chaudhary.
Sure, thanks. When I look at different countries, I think there are 3 things that really emerge out to me as a pattern or as a trend. One is, of course, there is this conventional approach where we talk about a linear approach. We keep increasing the amount of funding. We keep expecting that, okay, it will lead to higher, better technology, and therefore automatically we will grow. I think that needs to change. It's not a linear growth system. It has to be a systems approach. And that's what, again, you see in US and everywhere else. We're not investing just in infrastructure. We're investing in infrastructure. We're investing in people. We're investing in systems, processes, newer capabilities. And that is what leads to a creation of culture, which allows innovation, which allows technology diffusion. So I think it has to be a systems-driven approach versus the conventional linear approach. Then second, I think what's really struck to me from China is how they have a very specific goal-oriented approach. They set out goals for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and then that keeps evolving. And I think we saw a glimpse of that in our COVID time. We were setting out goals for ourselves that, okay, this is a problem that we have to solve, and everybody came together to solve that problem. So I think that specific goals, if we list out at national level, state level, district level, which then percolates to the industry, percolates to the academia, to startups, to everyone, that will bring a cohesion, which will really, again, allow us to solve problems of all different kinds. So putting out specific goals and keep evolving them as the market evolves is what is another thing, which I see very common in different countries. And I think the third important aspect is about bringing in these innovation complementarities. Innovation, we generally look at it, okay, there's a technology and I have this beautiful outcome of a technology, so I've done my innovation. But if that needs to scale up, we need to build newer capabilities in our leaders. We need to talk about managerial capabilities. We need to talk about productivity. So I think, again, there is this huge lens for innovation, which we are missing through these complementarities that also needs to be plugged into the mainstream conversation when we talk about innovation. I think these are some three patterns which I see when I look at different countries. Thanks.
Great. So we have a few minutes left. I think that the lessons you both have highlighted from other countries are very helpful for India to think about and hopefully imbibe. Everything, I think, from a higher R&D spend allocation to taking a systems approach to being more goal-oriented, looking at both our strengths and weaknesses. One could argue, Ms. Bahadur, that much like you were referring to the water problem for Israel and how Israel turned that into their advantage, right? You could today look at our innovations around UPI and Aadhaar as taking our weakness of lack of financial inclusion being turned into an advantage.
Exactly.
Today, where now we are saying, now let's export this infrastructure, this technology to other countries that are maybe not as advanced on the fintech side. That's a very similar, I think, example as to the water example that you cited. One can argue that Israel also turned its security problem to its strength. Right? Today, they are one of the major exporters of security technology, whether in the cyber world or otherwise also. And you can say that that was a weakness for them, an existential problem that they turned into the advantage. And so we could look at extending, I think, the fintech innovation piece that we've started off, embarked on over the last decade, and extending that to maybe the health and education sectors, I think, as India is trying to do, to take that India Stack piece to other sectors in India as well. But let me try and end on a slightly more positive note as well. We've obviously spoken a lot about the gaps that exist, the pieces that we're not doing, the lack of trust between academia and industry today, lack of coordination, one can argue, between national, district, state, and district levels, and between the private and public sector and academia. But let me ask you a question around a positive piece, which is, what are some of the, and I think, Ms. Chaudhary, you've referred obviously to the COVID time when the academia and industry came together, but let me ask you, what are some of the bright spots you see in the Indian context, in the R&D context, in the S&T context, that exist today that could be seen as strengths to be leveraged and scaled further? What are maybe some of those small ecosystems that do exist that seem to be working well? What are some sectors that we seem to have strengths in? What are some institutions within India that seem to be really doing innovative work that's getting adopted and scaled, right? So let's maybe spend the last few minutes of our conversation today and talk about the bright spots within the Indian context, in the science and technology and R&D context, that could be tomorrow, let's say, leveraged and scaled further. So I'll start maybe with you, Ms. Bahadur, and then I'll come to Ms. Chaudhary.
Okay. So see, the bright spots is that, of course, these we have evolved with our STIP, the policies and the ecosystems. With every time in 10 years, if any policy, science and technology policy has come, it has resulted in, it has taken a leap forward. If we talk about having 1983's the policies, we got the TIFAC. Then in 2003 we got the SERB, and then 2013 onwards. So all these years we have got mission-oriented, water mission, nano mission. So Indian science and technology policy ecosystem has evolved, and recently having this, the Principal Scientific Advisor Office doing commendable job. So we are working, and with the government focus on enhancing the ecosystem with the funding and mission modes, we are going to make a mark. So there is no doubt on the future of it. And however, some positive note, if I would say, there are a few observations and suggestions, and just the 3 points with this I would like to end is that we have a lot of STM, STIP, NEP, we have everything, all the policies are there, but somehow the effective communication is not there, and the outreach to the masses or the common people or the school students or the college students who we expect to take up the STEM learning or innovation ecosystem. So, and the teachers at that level, they need to be more trained and better outreach. Second, as I would again say, we should have industry involvement with some corporate social responsibility, either having the CSR funds directly in the research, or having dedicated corporate STI fund kind of things. And this should come through organizations like FICCI, CII, SHM. And the third thing is involvement of government institutions. So just like we expect industry to adopt villages and do CSR activities, my submission would be that even the larger government institutions like the IITs, NITs, NICERs, NIPERs, central universities, they could also adopt a few school or colleges, very few, around their areas. And then they could also mentor nurture the talent over there. They could take their summer school projects or awarded projects to a level where it could be commercialized or taken to their incubation centers. And the member of these organizations who are generally in the expert committees should be on the other side of the table as well, taking these school students or college students and teachers in their mission mode projects. And this will help, should incentivize, and both should be incentivized in their APIs and appraisals. So this kind of incentivized approach will certainly help in developing the innovation ecosystem, right from school students, teachers, to college school students and teachers, and to higher levels. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Chaudhary, what are some of the bright spots you see?
Yes, I think for me, there are two clear bright spots. One is, of course, the financial capital in the form of the government investments that go into the S&T and R&D in India. Trust me, when we look at scientists outside India, they don't have this. And I know the Indian people will not like it. I can say it upfront. There is a sort of safety net that we have created. So I think that is a very sweet and a good spot to be in, that you keep getting the government funds irrespective of, you know, what you are doing. So I think that is something which we must sort of, which we are very lucky to have as against other different countries. And I think the second good spot is the human capital. We have a lot of young, bright scientists who really are extremely passionate about solving India's problems. So we need to really tap on them. And I think the good thing that we are doing is that we are opening up a lot of these high quality institutions like IITs, AIIMS, ICERs, and even others in tier 2, tier 3 cities. And I think the National Research Foundation, which has been brought together, which will bring together all of these, will further enable us to build on this bright spot of human capital. And I think one more point which goes around this is, you know, there have been initiatives from Niti Aayog also which talk about attracting younger people to science and technology through the Atal Tinkering Labs. So I think those are also some very beautiful, first of its kind examples from India for the world also, where how you can catch people young, introduce them to science and technology, to innovation, so that they develop this feeling of really, you know, staying around in India, bringing the best to India and working for the country. So I think the human capital, the financial capital, these are two good spots for us. We need to build more on that, I would say. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you both so much. So let me just, I think, highlight three things that stood out to me. Though I think this has been a very rich discussion, and I am definitely going to go back and look at the recording and take more copious notes about, I think, the clear insights that you have both offered. But I think one, I'll start, the three things that I'll highlight are, one, I think the mindset issue that Ms. Chaudhary, I think you mentioned earlier on, that ultimately to see R&D not as an expense, especially from a private sector standpoint, but really as a way to create wealth and solve problems, right? I think that mindset problem has definitely got to be solved. And I think the fact that I think even our Prime Minister in the most recent Independence Day speech, I think said that now Jai Anusandhan has to be along the same lines as Jai Kisan and Jai Jawan, I think is a good signal towards that. But really a mindset issues is important, one. Second, I think is the point I think that Ms. Bahadur, you mentioned also, and I think both of you mentioned really, is the tripartite linkages that need to really be improved upon. I think that's extremely important, whether that's done directly between these three or whether facilitators emerge in the form of, you know, venture capital firms, tinkering labs, incubators, accelerators, and so on and so forth, to help facilitate that tripartite cooperation. And third, I would really say, I think, is that priority discussion that we had, right? Which is, do we focus on those emerging tech priorities, or do we stay focused on the core problems that we have, let's say around financial inclusion or health or sanitation, and maybe hope that some really interesting innovations emerge from there, like we discussed have happened in the case of UPI and Aadhaar? Or do we do both, as Ms. Bahadur, I think you mentioned? And if we do both, then how do we mobilize the resources to do both, both in terms of human capital in terms of government capability at all the district, state, national levels, and also obviously capital and research capabilities. But I think all in all, a great discussion. Thank you very much to both of you for sharing such wonderful insights. I'll hand it back to Bhavya if you have any closing remarks. But thank you to everyone who's attended and participated and heard our panelists today as well. Thank you to everyone.
If Bhavya, I can just say one line that, I would really recommend everyone reading Anirudh's book, The Great Tech Game. I was lucky enough to get a copy of that before it got out through Professor Vijay Raghavan. So I think it's an amazing read. So all the younger people wanting to work in the area of science and tech, it's a great book to really read and understand how India is evolving, how the world is evolving. I really wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Thank you, Chaudhary.
Thank you. I'll be the next reader.
Over to you, Bhavya.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Suri, for moderating this wonderful discussion. Thank you, Dr. Ayesha. Thank you, Dr. Nupur. Unfortunately, Dr. Arun couldn't join us today because of his meeting. But this has been an amazing discussion. And I think one big takeaway for me will be invest in green tech. I think that's something that I got from today's discussion. Hopefully, that will turn out really well. And here's wishing 25 more great years of prosperity and onwards and upwards from here. So thank you so much to the audience for joining in today, and good night and have a good time. Thank you. Thank you.
Look forward to the cooperation and collaboration of all of us in future. Thank you so much for giving me some.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.